They were ready to believe the worst, because he refused to say a single word. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always come from a gun, hit like and follow. Now back to the story. The rope creaked softly above Elias Mercer's head, swaying just enough to catch the late afternoon sun as dust drifted through the air like ash from a long-forgotten fire. And still he stood there, wrists bound, shoulders steady, eyes calm in a way that didn't belong to a man moments away from judgment, because most men would have been shouting by now, pleading, explaining, grasping for anything that sounded like truth. But Elias said nothing, not when Sheriff Grant Holloway stepped closer with a face drawn tight from pressure he couldn't control, not when the crowd shifted in restless waves behind him, boots scraping dirt, whispers curling into assumptions that felt heavier than any evidence, and certainly not when the woman stood 20 feet away with her torn sleeve clutched tight against her chest, her dark eyes locked onto him with something no one in that town could quite read, because to them the story was already written. A white rancher, an Apache woman, a moment no one saw. But everyone believed they understood, and in a place like Dust Hollow, belief moved faster than truth ever could. The sun hung low, stretching shadows long across the wooden storefronts, turning faces into shapes of suspicion and certainty, and somewhere in that silence, a fly buzzed near the hitching post, the only thing careless enough to ignore what was happening. "You got something to say?" the sheriff asked, voice low enough to sound reasonable but loud enough for the crowd to hear. And for a moment Elias lifted his gaze, not defiant, not afraid, just steady, like a man measuring the weight of something no one else could see. Then he lowered it again, saying nothing, and that silence didn't calm the crowd. It fed it, because people don't trust what they don't understand, and they understand silence even less. A murmur rolled through the square, building slowly, turning into something sharper. Something that demanded resolution. "That's as good as admitting it," someone muttered from the back, and others nodded, because it was easier that way, easier to believe the worst than to question the story forming in their minds. The sheriff shifted his stance, glancing toward the edge of town where the horizon shimmered in the heat, because everyone knew this wasn't just about one man anymore. Not with Apache land stretching less than 10 miles out and tension already stretched thin as wire. Then came the sound, distant at first, barely more than a tremor beneath the wind, but enough to turn heads, enough to still the murmurs. Horses, more than a few, approaching slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world, and when they crested the ridge, they didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't draw attention to themselves. They simply arrived, one rider, then another, then a line forming behind them until the edge of Dust Hollow held more eyes watching than anyone in town had planned. For the Apache didn't speak, didn't move closer than they needed to. They just stood there, presence alone enough to press down on the square like a gathering storm. And still, in the center of it all, Elias Mercer didn't defend himself, didn't explain, didn't reach for anything that might save him, because somewhere beneath that silence was a choice already made, a line already drawn, one that no rope, no crowd, no judgment could make him cross. And as the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and dry earth through the square, the woman finally moved, just one step forward, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across the faces of those who thought they already knew the truth. The woman did not rush, and that was the first thing that unsettled them, because guilt usually moved fast, panic faster, but Nayeli walked with the kind of stillness that made even the horses at the edge of town lower their heads and breathe slower, her hand still holding the torn edge of her sleeve, not hiding it, not displaying it, just carrying it like something heavier than cloth. And when she stopped 10 feet from Elias Mercer, she did not look at the sheriff, did not look at the crowd. She looked only at him, as if the rest of the world had already fallen away. And for the first time since they tied him to that post, something shifted in the air between them, something quiet, something that did not need words. The sheriff cleared his throat, adjusting his stance as though authority could be straightened like a collar. "If you have something to say, now would be the time," he said. But his voice lacked the weight it carried minutes ago, because now there were too many eyes watching, not just townsfolk, not just whispers and assumptions, but men who did not speak unless it mattered. Apache riders who sat their horses without a sound, their presence stretching the moment thinner, sharper, like a wire pulled tight across the square, and still Elias said nothing, his silence no longer empty but deliberate, chosen, like a man holding a line no one else could see. A breeze moved through the street, lifting dust in slow spirals, brushing against boots, skirts, the wooden posts of the saloon, carrying with it the faint scent of river water and sage. And somewhere in that scent, memory began to take shape, not for the crowd, not for the sheriff, but for Nayeli, because she had stood in a place like this before, not in a town, not surrounded by strangers, but on the edge of rushing water where the current pulled harder than it looked, where a single misstep meant being taken by something that did not care about names or stories. And she remembered the moment she slipped, the way the world tilted, the way the water rose too fast, cold and unrelenting, and then a hand, rough, steady, pulling her back from something final, a hand that did not hesitate, did not ask permission, did not think about what it might cost, only that it had to be done. And in that moment, she had understood something that could not be explained to people standing dry in a dusty street, because to them, a torn sleeve was evidence, but to her, it was the price of being alive. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," the sheriff said, his patience thinning as he glanced toward the riders again, calculating consequences he did not want to face. "All he has to do is speak." And there it was, simple, clean, logical, the kind of solution people trusted because it sounded right. But Nayeli did not move, did not answer, because she knew what would follow if he did. She knew how quickly words could turn truth into something else, how easily a man could save himself, and, in doing so, take something from her that could never be given back. And Elias knew it too. That was the part none of them saw, the part that sat beneath his silence like stone beneath water. Steady, unmoving, invisible unless you knew where to look. One of the townsmen shifted forward, emboldened by the quiet. "If he is innocent, why does he not say it?" he asked, not to anyone in particular, just loud enough for others to agree. And they did, nods spreading like ripples, because it made sense, because innocence should be loud, should defend itself, should fight to be heard. But what if it did not? What if innocence looked like restraint, like refusal, like a man choosing something other than his own survival? The thought passed through a few minds, brief, uncomfortable, quickly buried beneath habit, because it was easier to believe what they had always believed, easier to follow the path already drawn in the dust beneath their feet. The Apache chief finally moved then, a slow shift in the saddle that drew every eye without a single word, his gaze traveling from the torn fabric in Nayeli's hand to the rope around Elias's wrists, measuring, weighing, not the evidence, but the space between it. And in that space, something waited, something that had not yet been spoken, something that could not be undone once it was, the kind of truth that changed more than just the fate of one man. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the square like silent witnesses, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a single word that might never come. The silence stretched so long it began to change shape, no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but heavy, deliberate, like something placed carefully in the middle of the town for everyone to see, but no one to touch. And Sheriff Grant Holloway felt it first, that slow shift slipping beneath his authority, because this was no longer a simple matter of accusation and answer, no longer something he could close with a firm voice and a final decision. This had become something else entirely, something that did not follow the rules he had spent his life relying on, and that unsettled him more than any raised weapon ever could. He took a step closer to Elias Mercer, lowering his voice as if proximity might force a truth out of him. "You are not helping yourself," he said quietly, almost like advice, almost like a warning. But Elias did not look at him, did not react, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the sheriff, beyond the moment itself, as if he had already stepped outside of what was happening and chosen his place in it. And that choice, invisible as it was, carried a weight that pressed down on everyone standing there. One of the Apache riders shifted in his saddle, not a threat, not a move toward conflict, just a subtle adjustment, but it drew attention. Because of what it represented, patience, control, the kind of restraint that mirrored the man tied to the post, and the chief, Taza, watched it all with eyes that missed nothing, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened, because he had seen men lie, had seen men beg, had seen men try to twist truth into something convenient. But this was different. This was a man refusing something, and refusal always had a reason, the kind that mattered more than words. Nayeli felt the weight of that gaze without turning, felt the expectation building not just from the town behind her, but from her own people at her back, because silence had consequences in both worlds, and she stood exactly where those worlds collided, holding something neither side could fully understand. Her fingers tightened slightly around the torn fabric, not out of fear, but out of memory, because she could still feel the pull of the river, still feel the force that had nearly taken her under, and more than that, she could feel the moment after, the stillness when everything stopped, when she realized she was standing on solid ground again, breathing air she almost lost, and beside her, the man who had made that possible had stepped back, not forward, had turned his eyes away instead of claiming anything, as if what he had done did not belong to him. And that was the part no one here could see, the part buried beneath assumption and judgment. A woman from the crowd spoke up then, her voice cutting through the quiet with the sharp edge of certainty. If he did nothing wrong, why does she not say it? And that question hung in the air, simple, direct, the kind that demanded an answer, but the answer was not simple, not something that could be given without cost. And that cost was what held Nayeli still, because to speak now was to open a door that could not be closed again. To confirm what happened meant revealing how it happened, and how it happened was something this town would twist, reshape, misunderstand, just as they already had. The sheriff exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw as he looked between them, calculating again, always calculating, trying to find the path that would keep order intact, because order was what he knew, what he trusted, what kept places like dust hollow from falling apart. But order built on the wrong truth was not order at all, and somewhere deep down, he knew that, even if he did not yet know what to do with it. Elias shifted his weight slightly against the rope, not struggling, not resisting, just adjusting to the length of time that had passed. And in that small movement, there was something steady, something unbroken, the kind of composure that did not come from ignorance of danger, but from acceptance of it. And that, more than anything else, began to unsettle the crowd, because guilt carried a different kind of energy, restless, defensive, searching for escape. But this man, he was not searching, he was waiting, and waiting meant he knew something they did not. A young boy near the edge of the square leaned closer to his father, whispering something too soft to hear. But the father did not answer, his eyes fixed on Elias with a growing uncertainty that spread slowly to others, like a crack forming in something once solid. And still no one spoke the truth, not yet, because the truth was not ready to be carried by just anyone. It required the right voice, the right moment. And as the last light of day dipped lower, painting the sky in muted gold and shadow, that moment drew closer, inevitable, quiet, and impossible to stop. The moment did not break the way people expected. There was no sudden shout, no sharp confession, no clear line drawn between right and wrong. Instead it deepened, like a canyon carved slowly by something unseen, and Sheriff Grant Holloway felt himself standing at the edge of it, unsure which step would hold and which would give way beneath him. He glanced again at Elias Mercer, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack that would make the decision easier. But there was none, only that same quiet resolve, a stillness that did not beg to be understood, and that unsettled him more than defiance ever could, because defiance he knew how to handle. But this was something else, something that did not fit inside the law he had been sworn to uphold. A man stepped forward from the crowd, hat pulled low, voice edged with frustration. "We cannot just stand here all day," he said, looking around as if to gather agreement. And some nodded, because waiting felt wrong, because silence demanded patience most of them did not have. But before the sheriff could respond, the sound of leather shifting broke through the tension. Chief Taza dismounted, slow and deliberate, boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty that drew every eye, without a single word spoken. He did not rush, did not posture. He simply walked forward, each step measured, as if the ground itself mattered. and when he stopped a few feet from Elias, he did not look at the rope, did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the man, studying him the way one studies something that cannot be explained with simple answers. And in that gaze there was no anger, no assumption, only a question that had not yet been asked. Nayeli felt her breath shift as her chief stepped beside her, not in front, not behind, but beside, a position that carried its own meaning, one that spoke of shared truth rather than command, and still she said nothing, because the weight of what needed to be said had not yet reached its breaking point. The sheriff straightened slightly, trying to reclaim some sense of control. "Chief Taza," he began, voice steady but careful, "we are handling this matter." But the words sounded thinner now, less certain, because even he could feel it, the way control had begun to slip from his hands and settle somewhere else entirely. Taza did not respond right away, his silence mirroring Elias's in a way that made the connection impossible to ignore. Two men standing in the same quiet, for different reasons, yet bound by something deeper than the rope between them. The crowd shifted again, unease growing not from fear, but from uncertainty, because certainty had been easy when this began. A torn sleeve, a pointed finger, a silent man. It had all fit together cleanly. But now the edges did not line up the way they should. A woman near the front lowered her voice, almost to herself. "Something is not right." And those words, soft as they were, carried farther than she intended, because they gave shape to a feeling others had begun to share, a feeling they did not want but could not ignore. The sheriff heard it too, and it tightened something in his chest, because doubt was dangerous in a place like this. Doubt unraveled order, and once it started, it was hard to stop. He turned back to Elias one more time, voice firmer now, almost demanding, "If you are innocent, you need to say it now." And for the first time, Elias moved more than a simple shift of weight. He lifted his head fully, meeting the sheriff's eyes with a calm that felt almost out of place. And for a brief second, something passed between them, not words, not even understanding, but recognition, as if the sheriff saw, just for a moment, that the man in front of him was not refusing out of stubbornness, but out of something far more deliberate, something that could not be undone once broken. And that realization made him hesitate, just long enough for the moment to stretch again, just long enough for Nayeli to feel the line she had been holding begin to pull tighter, because silence had carried them this far, but it could not carry them forever, and she knew it, felt it in the way the air had changed, in the way her chief now stood still beside her, waiting, not for the crowd, not for the sheriff, but for her, because this was no longer about accusation or defense. It was about truth, and truth, once spoken, would not belong to anyone again. The wind moved once more through Dust Hollow, lifting the edge of her sleeve, exposing the tear just enough for the light to catch it. And in that small, quiet movement, the final piece of the moment settled into place, unseen by most, but undeniable to those who knew what it meant. And as Nayeli drew in a slow breath, the silence that had held the town together began to shift towards something else, something that could not be held back any longer. The breath she drew did not rush out. It stayed there for a moment, held between what had happened and what had to be said. And in that pause the entire town seemed to lean forward without moving, as if the ground itself tilted toward her, waiting, because now they understood something was coming, something that would not fit inside the story they had already chosen. Nayeli stepped forward again, just one step, but it closed the distance enough that the details became clearer, the faint line of dried river water along the edge of her sleeve, the way the fabric had not been torn in anger but strained, pulled, stretched beyond what it was meant to hold. And that detail, small as it was, began to whisper a different version of events to those willing to see it. Sheriff Grant Holloway noticed it first, not because he was wiser than the others, but because doubt had already taken root in him, and once doubt begins, it looks for anything to grow. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion of her, but in reconsideration of everything he thought he knew. "You said he did this," the sheriff said carefully, not accusing now, but asking, and the words felt different in the air, less like a verdict, more like an opening. Nayeli did not answer right away, her gaze shifting briefly toward Chief Taza, who gave nothing in return, no nod, no command, just presence, because this was not his truth to speak. it was hers. And she understood that, felt the weight of it settle fully now, heavier than the silence had ever been, heavier than the rope binding Elias. Because truth carried consequences beyond a single man, it reached into how both sides would remember this moment, how they would see each other after it was over, and that was not something spoken lightly. A man in the crowd cleared his throat, impatience creeping back into his voice. "We are waiting," he said, and that simple statement revealed everything about the town, about how quickly they wanted resolution, how little they understood what resolution would cost. Nayeli finally looked back at Elias, and for the first time there was something visible in her expression, not fear, not anger, but recognition, the kind that forms when two people share a moment no one else witnessed, and in that look was an unspoken acknowledgement of what he had chosen, of what he continued to choose even now, standing bound, saying nothing. And that choice demanded something in return, something she could not delay any longer. "He pulled me from the river," she said, her voice steady, clear, carrying across the square without force, because truth did not need volume, it needed space, and the silence gave it plenty. The words settled over the crowd, simple, almost too simple, and for a moment they did not understand them, because they did not match the story they had built. The sheriff blinked once, processing. "The river," he repeated, as if saying it again might make it fit better. Nayeli nodded slightly, her hand loosening just enough on the torn fabric to reveal more of it. The direction of the tear, the strain along the seams, the kind that comes from being held against something stronger than water, not from harm, but from rescue. The current was strong. She continued, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not hidden, stronger than it looked. And as she spoke, the memory seemed to settle into the space around them, filling in the gaps their assumptions had left behind. A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their certainty slipping as the pieces began to rearrange into something new, something that did not accuse, something that did not demand punishment, something that required them to reconsider what they had been so ready to believe. Sheriff Holloway exhaled slowly, his hand dropping away from where it had hovered near his belt, because now the situation had changed, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable one. And those were the hardest to manage, because they left no room for pride, no easy way to step back without acknowledging the mistake. He looked at Elias again, really looked this time, not as a suspect, not as a problem to solve, but as a man who had stood in silence while others built a case against him. And in that silence there was something that now made sense, something that had been there from the beginning, waiting to be understood. The crowd did not speak, not yet, because understanding takes longer than judgment, and they were only just beginning to catch up to what had already happened. Chief Taza stepped forward then, not abruptly, not with authority, but with quiet intention, his eyes moving from Nayeli to Elias, then to the sheriff, and in that movement was a shift in balance, a recognition that the moment had changed, that what had been assumed no longer held, and that what came next would define more than just the fate of one man. The wind moved again through Dust Hollow, softer now, carrying less tension, but not yet peace, because the truth had been spoken, but its meaning had not yet fully settled. And as the last light of the sun dipped lower behind the buildings, casting long shadows that stretched across the square, one question remained unspoken, not what happened, but why he had chosen silence when a single sentence could have saved him, and that answer had not yet been given. The question did not come from the sheriff, nor from the crowd, nor even from Chief Taza. It rose quietly in the space between them all, carried in the way eyes shifted back to Elias Mercer, no longer looking for guilt, but for understanding, because now the truth of what happened had been spoken, simple and clear, and yet something remained unsettled, something that did not fit unless it was explained, and still, he said nothing. Sheriff Grant Holloway took a slow step back, his boots pressing into the dry earth as he exhaled through his nose, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not from relief, but from realization, because this was no longer a case to be solved. It was a moment to be understood, and understanding did not come from force, it came from listening. But listening required patience, and patience was something this town had nearly lost. "You could have said that," the sheriff finally said, not accusing, not even frustrated, just stating what now seemed obvious, his voice lower than before, quieter, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile that had just begun to form. Elias lifted his eyes again, this time not past them, not beyond them, but into the space they all shared, and for the first time there was something there, not defense, not justification, just a calm acknowledgement of what had been said. And still, no words followed. The crowd shifted again, but this time not with impatience, with something else, something closer to unease, because silence had changed meaning. It was no longer proof of guilt, but it was not yet fully understood either. It lingered in that uncertain place where people begin to question themselves. A man near the front rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the others as if searching for confirmation that they were all thinking the same thing. But no one spoke it. Not yet, because to say it out loud would mean admitting how quickly they had judged. Nayeli felt that shift ripple through them, saw it in the way their eyes no longer held the same certainty, and she understood what they were waiting for, not the truth of the river that had already been given, but the truth behind his silence, the part that belonged to him, not to her. And that was something she could not speak for him. Chief Taza stepped closer then, his presence steady, grounded, the kind that did not demand attention but held it all the same, his gaze settling on Elias with a depth that reached beyond the moment, beyond the rope, beyond the town itself. You chose not to speak, he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who understood that choices reveal more than words ever could. Elias met his eyes, and in that meeting something passed between them, not agreement, not challenge, but recognition, a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. And still the chief waited, not pressing, not demanding, simply allowing the space for an answer if one came. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing against the edges of clothing, lifting a bit of dust that caught the fading light. And in that quiet, stretched moment, Elias finally shifted his stance just enough to ease the strain of the rope, drawing a slow breath, the kind that comes before a decision, not one made in the moment, but one carried from before, one that had already shaped everything that followed. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, unhurried. Because if I said it, he began, pausing just long enough for the words to settle before continuing. They would have asked how. The simplicity of it landed harder than anything spoken before, not because it was complicated, but because it was not, because it revealed the part none of them had considered, the part hidden beneath their assumptions, the part that made his silence not an absence of truth, but a protection of it. The sheriff's brow tightened slightly, understanding beginning to take shape as he followed the thought to its natural end. And when it reached him, it settled heavily, because he saw it now, saw what would have happened, how questions would have turned, how explanations would have crossed lines no one here truly understood. Nayeli lowered her gaze for a moment, not in shame, but in acknowledgement, because his words had carried the truth she could not have spoken for him, the truth that belonged to the space between them. The crowd grew still, more still than before, because now they were not just hearing what happened, they were seeing what almost happened, what would have been lost if he had chosen differently. A young boy near the edge of the square looked up at his father again, this time not whispering, just watching, learning something that had no easy name. And as the last light slipped further down the horizon, leaving dust hollow in the soft gray of approaching evening, the silence returned once more, but it was not the same silence as before. This one carried understanding, and with it, the weight of everything they had nearly gotten wrong. The words settled into the town like dust after a long ride, slow, quiet, impossible to gather back once they touched the ground, and no one moved for a moment, not the sheriff, not the riders, not even the men who had spoken the loudest before, because what Elias Mercer had said did not argue, did not defend, it simply revealed, and in revealing it changed everything they thought they understood. Sheriff Grant Holloway lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of that realization pressing into him, in a way that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with judgment, because he had asked for words, demanded them even, and now he saw that words would have done more harm than silence ever could. He exhaled slowly, stepping closer to the post, his hand hesitating for just a second before reaching for the rope, not out of uncertainty about what to do, but because he understood what that small action now represented. the undoing of something the town had been too quick to build. The rope loosened with a soft scrape against wood, fibers giving way under careful hands. And as it fell away from Elias's wrists, there was no cheer, no relief spoken out loud, only a quiet shift, like a storm that had passed without rain, leaving behind something heavier than before. Elias lowered his arms slowly, not rushing, not shaking them free like a man desperate for release, but simply letting them rest at his sides, as if the rope had never been the thing holding him there in the first place. And in that small movement, dignity returned to him in a way no apology ever could. The sheriff stepped back, clearing his throat once, but no words followed, because none seemed enough. The crowd remained still, faces turned not away, but inward, each person caught in the quiet recognition of how easily they had filled the silence with something that was never there. A man near the front removed his hat, not out of ceremony, not out of habit, but because something in him understood. Respect had just shifted direction, and he did not yet know how to carry it. Nayeli stood where she had been, the torn fabric still in her hand, but now it no longer felt like evidence. It felt like memory, like a mark of something that had passed and left its lesson behind. She looked at Elias again, not with urgency now, not with the pressure of what needed to be said, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. And for a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that meeting there was no debt, no obligation, only acknowledgement, the kind that exists between two people who chose the same path. Without needing to speak it, Chief Taza stepped forward once more, his presence steady as the fading light, and he inclined his head just slightly toward Elias. Not a bow, not submission, but recognition, a gesture that carried more weight than any words offered in that square, and Elias returned it with the smallest movement, a nod that did not seek attention but did not hide either, because some things, once understood, do not need to be explained further. The Apache riders began to turn their horses then, one by one, not hurried, not dramatic, simply leaving as they had arrived, without noise, without spectacle, because their purpose had never been to threaten, only to witness. And now there was nothing left to witness. The sheriff watched them go, then turned back to the town, his eyes moving over the people he had been responsible for, and for the first time, he did not speak, because he understood that this was not a moment to command. It was a moment to remember. The sun slipped lower behind the buildings, shadows stretching long and thin across the ground where Elias had stood bound just minutes before, and the space he occupied now felt different, not because it had changed, but because they had. And as the first hint of evening settled over Dust Hollow, a quiet truth remained in the air, one no one needed to say out loud, that sometimes a man's silence does not hide the truth, it protects it. And once you understand that, you do not forget it easily. Even after the riders disappeared beyond the ridge and the last trace of their presence faded into the evening light, no one in Dust Hollow moved right away, as if the town itself needed time to catch up with what had just happened, the kind of moment that does not end when it is over, but lingers, settling into the spaces between thoughts, between words, between the quiet glances people now avoided giving each other. Sheriff Grant Holloway remained near the post, his hand resting loosely at his side where it had once hovered with purpose. And for a long moment he simply stood there, not as a man in charge, but as a man reconsidering the weight of that role, because authority, he realized, was not just about making decisions, it was about knowing when not to. And today, he had come close to forgetting that. He turned slightly, looking toward Elias Mercer, who had already stepped away from the center of the square, not seeking attention, not waiting for acknowledgement, just moving with the same quiet steadiness that had carried him through everything before. And there was something in that struck deeper than any confrontation could have. Because men who need to prove themselves stay, they speak. They demand to be seen. But Elias did none of that. He simply left the place where judgment had almost claimed him, as if it no longer held any meaning. Nayeli watched him go for a moment longer than she intended, her fingers finally loosening around the torn fabric, letting it fall gently against her side, because it no longer needed to be held as proof. Its purpose had passed, but its meaning remained. And that meaning did not belong to the town, did not belong to her people, it belonged to the quiet space between what happened and what could have happened. She turned then, not toward the crowd, but toward the path leading away from Dust Hollow, following at a distance that did not intrude, did not claim, just enough to close the space left behind by everything unsaid. The townspeople began to stir slowly, not with the energy they had before, but with something more restrained, more careful. As if each movement now carried a question they had not yet answered, a man picked up his hat from where he had set it down, brushing dust from the brim that had never really mattered. A woman adjusted her shawl, though the evening air had not yet cooled. Small gestures, ordinary, but each one touched by the same quiet awareness, the same understanding that something important had shifted. Sheriff Holloway finally stepped away from the post, the empty rope still hanging loose against the wood, a silent reminder of how close they had come to getting it wrong. He did not remove it, did not cut it down, because some things are meant to stay for a while, to be seen, to be remembered, even if no one speaks of them. He walked toward the edge of the square, stopping briefly as he passed the spot where Elias had stood, his eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again, not in regret, but in acknowledgement, the kind that does not ask for forgiveness, only promises not to forget. Out beyond the last building, the light had softened into a deep, fading gold, stretching long across the open land where Elias now walked alone, his figure steady against the horizon, not hurried, not looking back, as if the path ahead mattered more than anything behind him. Nayeli closed the distance slightly, her steps quiet, measured, until she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. But for a moment, she did not, because some silences are not empty. They are full of everything that does not need to be said. And when she finally did speak, her words were simple, carrying none of the weight the town had placed on them before. "You could have let them believe it," she said, not as a question, not as a judgment, just as a truth laid gently between them. Elias did not stop walking, but he turned his head just enough to acknowledge her presence, his expression unchanged, steady as it had always been. "That would have been easier," he replied, and there was no pride in it, no sacrifice, just fact, the kind that sits quietly without asking to be noticed. They walked a few more steps in silence, side by side but not touching, not crossing into each other's space. The distance between them filled with something neither tried to name, because naming it would have made it smaller, and some things are meant to remain as they are, unspoken, understood, as the last light of day slipped behind the hills, leaving only the soft hush of evening settling over the land. Nayeli slowed her pace, knowing where her path turned away, and before she did, she looked at him one last time, not for confirmation, not for closure, but simply to see him as he was, a man who had chosen silence when it mattered most, and in doing so, had said more than words ever could. Then she turned, disappearing into the fading light, leaving Elias Mercer to walk on alone, the quiet stretching out before him, vast and open, carrying with it a truth no one in Dust Hollow would soon forget, and one question that would stay with them long after the dust had settled. Not what happened, but how many times before had they mistaken silence for guilt, when it had been something else entirely. The night came quietly to Dust Hollow, not with wind or storm, but with a stillness that settled over the town like a weight no one could quite shake. And even hours after the square had emptied, after the last lanterns flickered to life along the wooden porch rails, something remained, something unseen but deeply felt, because moments like that do not leave when the people do. They stay, woven into the place itself, into the boards beneath their feet, into the silence between words that are never spoken again. Sheriff Grant Holloway stood alone outside his office, hat in hand, turning it slowly as if the motion might settle the thoughts that refused to rest. He had enforced laws for years, had made decisions that shaped lives in ways both small and large, but tonight felt different, because tonight he had nearly mistaken silence for guilt, and that realization did not sit lightly. It stayed with him, pressing into him in a way that no badge could shield. He looked out toward the dark stretch of land beyond the last building, where the horizon had long since swallowed the last trace of daylight. And somewhere out there walked a man who had chosen to stand still when everything told him to speak, and in doing so had shown something the sheriff knew he would not forget, not tomorrow, not next year, maybe not ever. Inside the town, the people moved quieter than usual, voices lowered, laughter absent. not because they had been told to be quiet, but because something in them had shifted, something that made noise feel out of place. A woman who had stood near the front earlier now sat at her kitchen table, staring at her hands as if they might explain why she had believed so quickly. A man who had spoken loudest now avoided the eyes of others, not out of shame that needed to be named, but out of an understanding that did not need words. And in the far corner of the saloon, a young boy sat beside his father, asking no questions, because for the first time, he had seen that answers were not always spoken, that sometimes they stood in silence, waiting to be understood. Out beyond the town, the land stretched wide and open under a sky filled with quiet stars, and Elias Mercer walked beneath them without hurry, his steps steady, his path unbroken, not because he had somewhere to be, but because movement forward was all that mattered now. The past had settled behind him, not erased, not forgotten, but placed where it belonged, as something that shaped but did not define. And in that quiet space between each step, there was no need to explain, no need to justify, only the simple truth of what had been done and what had been chosen. Miles behind him, where the road bent slightly toward the river that had started it all, the sound of water carried faintly through the night air, softer now, calmer, as if it too had released what it once held. And for a moment, Elias paused, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when a place no longer feels like a threat, but like a memory. He looked toward the dark outline of the riverbank, then continued on without a word, because some moments are not meant to be revisited, only remembered. And far back in Dust Hollow, Sheriff Holloway finally placed his hat back on his head, drawing a slow breath before stepping inside, not as the same man who had stood in that square hours ago, but as one who now carried something different, something quieter, something that would guide him the next time silence stood before him. Because out here, justice did not always come from the loudest voice, and it did not always wear a badge. Sometimes it stood still, said nothing, and waited for the world to understand it. And as the night deepened and the town settled into uneasy rest, one truth remained, unspoken but certain, that a man's silence, when chosen for the right reason, does not hide who he is, it reveals it. And those who witnessed it would carry that lesson long after the dust had settled, whether they ever spoke of it again or not.